Welcome guys to today's tutorial and we'll be talking about the supply chain theory, and in this class we're just basically introducing the concepts as we build on them in the coming classes and video tutorials. So if you have a question, just keep them on hold until we have the revision webinar class. So today's video summary has several things that I wanted us to look at. The first one will be just a definition of a key term here, and we are introducing the term supply chain management. Then we will have what are the parts of a supply chain, what is the goal of any given supply chain, and what are the production systems that can be used when designing supply chain work considerations, and what changes have supply chains gone through in the years that have been. So to start us off, I always like this definition. It's a basic World Wide Web accepted definition, and it holds that a supply chain is the entire handling of flow of goods or service to maximize 1. Quality, 2. Delivery, 3. Customer experience, and lastly cost. And combining this with parts of a supply chain, several things would emerge. The first one would be a conventional supply chain moves towards the customer. These are activities that we are doing to make sure we move goods and services towards the customer. On this end, we have what you call the nodal firm, and on this end we have what you call the supply side. On the lower end, after production of goods or services, we have what you call the demand side. The customer is here. Sometimes we have a retailer between the customer. We also have a distributor between the retailer and the nodal firm. Now on this side we have a supplier, and we can have a 2-tier level where we say if you have 3 levels on the supply side, that's a 3-tier system. If you have 2 suppliers, that's a 2-tier system. And this is important to remember, because by assumption or by deduction we can see that the number of people within any given supply chain will affect the final price, because the final price is calculated by the cost of production, that's one, and you can have taxation and other mandatory payments. Now this cost of production is building by the step as the supplier moves the goods, adds value from their stage, moves the goods to the next step, does the same thing, adds value, moves the goods to the nodal firm. Now as a recap, we can say therefore that there are 3 parts to any given supply chain. You have the nodal firm, you have the supply side of the supply chain, then you have the demand side of the supply chain. The demand side of the supply chain is concerned with meeting the orders of the customer. Now the supply side is concerned with providing raw materials that are needed to produce the goods. Now we say that while this is a holistic look of the supply chain, there are several processes that are involved when managing supply chains. The first one is planning, the second one is manufacturing, the third one is logistics, the fourth one is sourcing, the fifth one is any auxiliary processes that are there. Now the nodal firm in this case is the firm which, when there are tiny changes within the supply chain, their performance overall is affected. I'll repeat, a nodal firm is the firm by which any changes within the supply chain or any supply disruptions, they will always affect this farm the most. That's the farm that carries the identity of the whole supply chain. And in the other videos that we've been speaking about, we have farms like EABL here, and you have farmers at the back end who are supplying barley and other raw materials that EABL needs to produce their booze with. Now on this side we have distributors, retailers, and customers. Now anything that happens within the supply chain is going to affect the nodal farm, and this involves simple things as increase in taxation. When these taxes are going up, the farms that are being affected the most are not this one, but the bottom line of the EABL franchise or EABL farm. Now, when we think then, what is the purpose of a supply chain, or what is the goal of the supply chain? It is therefore to provide a good price for the product. That's one. Two, to make sure there is availability of goods. And three, to give variety to the customer. And four, to balance demand and supply. Let me explain. Every supply chain is not structured the same in any given industry. If you were to give the example of EABL competing with Castle, competing with Kiroche, they are not using the same structure of supply chain from top to bottom. Now, the structure therein in EABL or Castle or Kiroche is a source of competitive edge to the farm. Now, this is to mean that a person who is structuring an efficient supply chain wants to give the same product but at a better price. There's another one that will say it is good to structure it in a different way to enhance the customer experience. Another one will say let's structure it differently to enhance variety within our customer offering pool or value proposition. But at all times the structure will always be different. All the three firms are competing for the same shilling, and it is very unlikely that they are using the same supply chain without risking cannibalization. Now, therefore, it is clear that price is an important aspect of it. And the more people, as we had said before, you hold within the supply chain, the higher the price. But there is an advantage to this. If you can be able to have more people within the supply chain decoupled from each other, you're likely to enhance product availability, because you are using a distributor to hold stock. Even though there might be production disruptions at this stage, you can be using the retailers to hold stock, even though there might be lead time challenges around this step over here. So availability can be enhanced by using other partners within the supply chain to buy or acquire the goods and bring them closer to the customer. Now, the other thing that we need to speak about in availability is an aspect of distribution management, where we say while EABL is producing their goods within Nairobi and some are being imported from their main parent farm, it is important to note that there is so much ABL can do when it comes to bringing the product as close as possible to the customer. Now, if they wanted to create an infrastructure, or if they wanted to create an ecosystem where they bring the goods to the customer themselves, it would be a very expensive and tedious process. Therefore, to enhance availability, you need a distributor who is closer to the user points within the market. The distributor is offering depth probably, but the retailer can be able to offer breadth, where they can collect products from Keroche, Castle, EABL and store them within the same locality. But don't forget, the distributor is closer to the customer, but the retailer is closest to the customer. Therefore, removing the retailer would compromise in a very big way a farm's ability to provide to provide availability of the product. Now, the other goal that every supply chain needs to exist for would be matching supply and demand. And I always say this is a science as it is an art. It is a science and an art, because on one end you have the demand side, and on the other end you have the supply side. The most desired solution is where demand equals supply, or vice versa, where we do not have wastage. It is a lean approach, or an equilibrium approach. But the reality of the matter is that there will always be a mismatch between what the customer orders and what the company ends up supplying. Now, if the customer has more orders than the company can be able to handle, we have what you call shortages. And these shortages will cause, again, customer switching. And this is called cost of switching. Now, depending on the product, the cost of switching can be high or it can be low. I will repeat, depending on the nature of the product, the cost of switching can be high or low. Let's see with some example. You have a company called Safaricom, you have another company called Airtel. Now, all of us are captive consumers of Safaricom because of their subscriber base, one, M-Pesa 2, and other products that are very, very captive in nature, in the sense that you cannot easily switch to Airtel without compromising the experience. So the cost of switching in that case is deemed to be very, very high. Now, if there is something you demand from Safaricom and it is not there, within a high cost of switching, chances are high the only thing that you will have is a poor customer experience, but you will not switch. But within a perfect competition, this is not the case. KPLC is another example. Cost of switching is too high for you to switch from the off-grid to off-grid solar power and move away from the on-grid KPLC distribution. The cost is too high. Therefore, what happens when there are outages? What happens when there is poor service and so forth? It is only a compromised customer experience, but you will not switch. But most firms exist within a perfect competition. And within a perfect competition, we say the cost of switching is very low. And if you do not supply at any point the goods that are being demanded, your customers will always switch and move to your competitor. Now, the more they switch to your competitor, the more it becomes a problem for you, because it consolidates that position if repeated long enough. If this sequence happens once or twice or thrice, repeated strongly enough, you're going to lose a serious customer base. Therefore, we say matching demand and supply, it is not a luxury, it is a requirement, it is an act of survival, especially when you're selling goods within a perfect competition. So how do you do this? Are you using a pull system? Are you using a push system? What are your forecasting models? What are your data models, and how are you projecting this data to inform your production systems? Now, that is the science that we'll be talking about later. But to recap again, if you supply more than the customer demanded, there is another problem. Again, it is still wastage nonetheless, but you are tying up capital within your supply chain, and this capital is in form of stocks. Now, we say this is very, very significant because every product has what we call a depreciation rate, and this is what we give the aggregate depreciation within the year. So for example, EABL is dealing with alcohol. Every alcohol tends to have its own depreciation rate, but not to say that it loses value, but in terms of the time value of money incurred by the time we recover that cost. But a simpler one to be able to envision what we mean by depreciation would be electronics, where we say an electronic will lose value at the rate of 0.01%. Now that is a very high number if you take it to the year. Now if you take another one, would be Mills Bakers, pastries is their product. Now those products will lose value on a weekly basis. So if you do not push as much as possible within the supply chain, a lot of that product will be depreciated, or you're going to count the cost of wastage for that product. So you have to make sure that you are at the precise sweet spot where the supply is as close to the demand, and the demand is not unmet at any given point. Demand and supply. So holistically then, these are the things that we say all supply chain exists to meet. But there is a paradox here. We say that if you want to give a good price within your supply chain, sometimes you have to compromise on your value proposition. It is more or less an inverted relationship, because the very act of cutting costs means that there is something that you have to do away with or act in a lean manner to be able to provide the product at a good price. That is simply put. Now another example would be, if you want to give variety in your supply chain, then you must be willing to risk having surplus within that supply chain. So we say that in terms of competitive edge, you must determine what exactly is important to your organization, what is the competitive edge that you're trying to provide, and once you are determined in terms of the goal of your supply chain, you are pivoting from time to time, making sure that you optimize your options within our supply chain. Now beyond the goal of supply chain and beyond the parts of a supply chain, we say that there are several things you need to consider. The first one is, what kind of production systems will we use, and what are the considerations to have when you are designing a supply chain? Now this is why let me explain why this is important. We know for a fact that not all products are the same. Products are different. That's one. Two, we also know for a fact demand is always a fluctuating variable. So if we create a production system that is too rigid, we risk losing out. If we create a production system that is too versatile, we might have the flexibility of meeting needs within the market, but again it will come at a very huge price. So when designing a supply chain and when deciding what production system we're going to use, you need to have a holistic picture of the whole process of supply chain management from top to bottom. But simply put, let me start us off with this. let me first of all erase this. Let me see. Let me erase this first. Okay, so that's clear. Let's get back to this. So production system and supply chain design. So this supply chain structure that we're looking at here, 2-tier on either side or 2 levels on either side, is a conventional one. Now, there are certain challenges that come with every supply chain, especially this that we are looking at. And to really explain this, I'll use what we call the informational asymmetry concept to show exactly how this happens. Note that information is power, and this is very, very true, especially when it comes to supply chain management. And moving forward from step to step, information asymmetry is always created, and this is where the information within the various users of a process is not the same. So if we had party 1, party 2, party 3, and party 4, and the information here is A, then if we have perfect information symmetry, at 2 information should be A, and at 3 information should be A. The same case applies to 4. But in most cases, the information tends to get lost or clogged up within the whole value chain, where the information is not A here, it may be A minus, or the information here may be A plus, and so forth, depending on which integration systems are there at what point. Now, this information asymmetry is what causes decision change or decision parameters to be different for each user point. And this is what I mean. Person 1 is making their decisions based on A. Person 2 is making their decisions based on A minus. Person 3 is making their decision based on A, and person 4 is making their decision based on A plus. Now, the final decision that they will arrive at is based on the information they have. But what 4 does not know is that 3 has A, 2 has A minus, and 1 has A. Therefore, whenever they'll be making their decisions, even though they are within the same ecosystems, we will be having what you call disparities within the structure of decision. And this is what we call information asymmetry. Let's see an example. The customer here orders 1,000 units, but the problem is the system that the customer is using to order is not integrated at the distributor level, and going backwards, there is no integration moving forward and moving down. And let me explain what I mean by integration here. When we say let me just explain that lastly, and I'll explain this with reverse logistics as a function. Anyway, we go back here. Because we are not integrated holistically from top to bottom, if we were, it would be very easy to note that within any production cycle that the farmer here should provide raw materials that would help us to meet the need of 1,000 and 1,000 only. That's a classical ideal situation, but it's not practical really. Therefore, these 1,000 orders are given to the retailer but not the distributor, and the retailer must stock more than this 1,000. So you find 1,500 are stocked here, so he sends 1,000, 500 remains trapped within the retailer stage. But to replenish his stock, he might order 1,300 to the distributor, and the distributor will say, I need to produce 2,600. and order some more from EABL, maybe 3,500, just as an example. And on and on and on it goes backwards. But if you look at these numbers keenly, they're showing a serious disparity, and this disparity is coming from the information asymmetry that you have within your production system. It is not integrated, that's one, and two, everyone is making their decision as an autonomous unit. The distributor is behaving as though they were autonomous, the retailer is behaving as though they are autonomous, and the manufacturer is behaving as though they are autonomous. But do not forget, all these three exist to serve one customer, and this one customer is providing a number which we can be able to predict with some degree of certainty. So integration would help. Now this is what we call a bullwhip effect. It seems very simple on paper, but some companies have experienced serious cash crunch issues, including Nakumat, which are to shut down because of stock pile-ups within the supply chain, and all these stock pile-ups is accounting for millions and millions of shillings. So when thinking about a production system, you need to ask yourself, which kind of a system helps me make sure that the information asymmetry is solved? That's one. Two, helps me meet the demand as much as possible while minimizing the wastage. And the reason is that we say you can have what you call a lean system or an agile system, supply chain system. Within a lean system, you are trying as much as possible to control the wastage within your ecosystem, and you are trying to remove as many non-productive or non-essential resources being trapped in there. And this is where we have things as supplier-based rationalizations, and we shall be using the case study of Toyota and Mahindra to show this. But agile supply chains are somewhat different in the sense that they are designed to be adaptive and enhance resilience. This is basically why an agile system exists, to be an adaptive supply chain to the changes in the environment, and also to be resilient in the sense that it can handle supply chain disruptions without being too compromised. Now, there are certain aspects of resilience. I'll not talk about them here. We'll talk about them later when we'll be speaking about more on the theory. But pay keen attention in this case. Supply chain adaptiveness and supply chain resilience is an aspect of responsiveness, and this is what I mean. We just came from a COVID pandemic shutdown, and the companies that were agile were likely to perform better than companies that are not agile, because being agile means flexible. You're trying to change with the changing environment and try to see how best can you be able to meet the changes within the within the ecosystem or the environment, but you still maintain competitiveness. That is the most important thing. So are we going to use a lean production system or an agile production system? And just as a rhetorical question, do you think a lean supply chain system is cheaper than an agile supply chain system? Now we move on. Before we go to the types, I would like to speak about disintegration in a functional or design in design mode. And this is what we mean. An integrated supply chain is where the parties within the various levels are owned by the same franchise brand. And when we are speaking about an integrated supply chain, the goal here is control. And within control, we want to enhance supply chain visibility. And this is shown by the case study under Harvard Business School of Apple, and I'll explain. I am selling the product at this point. Let me just erase this a minute. Let me just erase this. Okay, so let me draw that again. So within a conventional state, we say that this company, Apple, is selling a product called iPhone, MacBooks, and what have you. Now, these products are moving to the various distributor shops across the globe, and there's some retailers that have taken on the job of buying from the distributor shops uh, with the intent of making a profit. And sometimes the customer who's buying it might not be the end consumer, so there's that to consider. But whenever you're thinking about the challenges of a disintegrated supply chain system, think of it this way. The minute Apple decides to outsource to their suppliers in China, they had a vision, and this is the vision that they had. The first one was they were going to get tax breaks, and these tax breaks would help them to achieve the current $1 trillion status that they have. And the reason is that if you can evade the harsh tax regime in America and evade even a more harsh labor tax in China, you're likely to benefit. It's a win-win for you at any point. And Apple is the perfect example why Trump might not be able to bring back these jobs to America, and I'll explain why. For China, it is an export-intensive country, and they say that this is their rule. If you're exporting, that is tax exempt. So if I am Apple and I establish my supply system within China, the export will be tax exempt. Now, America, on the other hand, has a tax rule, and the tax rule is if it is an American brand importing into America, it is tax exempt, which means, again by implication, that I produce goods within China and I exported without paying tax, and I imported goods within America without paying any tax. Now, that is the perfect tax loophole that that Apple took. And there are very many other companies that have done this, including Dell, that has been able to be very, very competitive. The other reason Apple opted to go to China was their labor laws. They are very flexible in the sense that it is not as strict when it comes to code breaks. It is not as strict when it comes to labor enforcement. It is not as strict when it comes to industrial action, and the labor supply is huge, we're speaking of huge numbers, and the average wage is as low as possible. The minimum wage within America, producing those products within America, would take the cost of the product too high compared to moving it to China. Now that means that if there were breaches of laws in China, Apple would likely escape than if they were in USA. The third reason why they opted to take this to China would be flexibility. And flexibility seen in this sense. When Steve Jobs said that at some point he wanted to change the 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 cover of the iPhone 5, I think, I forget, it's iPhone 5 should be, and he wanted to move from plastic to glass. Now, in practice, he said that if we were using our USA system, it would take us 5 months to just make that change from plastic to glass. But in China, this change was made within 2 weeks, and the supplier was willing to make that change immediately. Now, having these three things is a serious win for any given company, but it doesn't come without problems and headaches, and this is what I mean. One is China has some serious labor issues, and most border on abuse and human rights violation. And the reason is I say this is because two of the suppliers that were under Apple, one of them being Pegatron and the other one being Foxconn, have been accused of gross misconduct. BBC did an expose, a docu-series where they showed that employees were sleeping in the line because they're being overworked. There was one employee who was tortured because they lost the prototype of the iPhone 5 series. You had people committing suicide by jumping over the buildings. They had bad working conditions and bad breaks. They were working more than the required 8 hours. And the reason why that was, Apple was applying pressure to the supplier, first of all, to squeeze their margins, and to squeeze their margins hard, and which they did. And for them to control their costs, they had to put their workers to put in more hours. Now, all this ecosystem can operate in China until the expose. And this is when the end consumer over here discovered that there were huge violations at Pegatron and huge violations at Foxconn, sorry, at Foxconn, and they demanded that Apple do something about it. And this is during a very prevalent cancel culture. And we say that when this issue was exposed, Apple doing the investigations and the problem is happening at this stage, then the question you need to ask is, does Apple have control over what their suppliers in China do? And should the customer on this end cancel or start boycotting Apple products because of something Apple does not have control over? But this brings the question of bargaining power of buyers and sellers that we use in discussion of supply chain theory later in the series to come. We say that if you have bargaining power as a buyer, then you have a moral responsibility to bring about change within the ecosystem in which you are buying from, even though you do not have control over it. And from that, we have seen changes that have been done, but most changes are just very superficial. Putting nets on buildings so that when people try to commit suicide, they just fall on the nets does not deal with the issue. But if there is any key takeaway from this issue that Apple faced, is an integrated supply chain gives you control. And you're speaking of control of what each and every person within the supply chain is doing if you are integrated. And that control enhances supply chain visibility, where you can see everything that every person within the supply chain is doing. Now that helps you avoid this kind of issue when you can see, when you're not caught off guard like Nike and you're told your suppliers are using child labor, when you're told that you're a designer bag company but your crocodiles are being tortured and raised in inhumane conditions. All those things you can be able to control if you are integrated. But for you to be integrated, you must lose on something, and the thing is costs. And this is where the disintegrated system comes in. And within a disintegrated system, you're saying control is not very important to me, supply chain visibility is not very important to me, but cost really is. Therefore, let me allow them free rein to do whatever they will do, and I will control the outcome as we go. But my goal is costs. So if it means having a supply in South Korea, having another one in Hong Kong, having another one in mainland China, and on, and others in Taiwan, I will do it because my goal is not visibility, but my goal is cost. And this paradox has always been there, where you are asking yourself as a as as a buyer or as a corporate as a corporate organization, which is the best approach. So if I am buying from, if I am insourced, for example, locally, or if I am insourced globally, what is the cost structure and what is the control structure? If I am outsourced locally or I am outsourced globally, what is the control structure and what is the cost structure? And this is what we mean. An insourced is an integrated system. So it can either be an insourced locally system or an insourced global system where I establish my own factory in China as Tesla. That's an example of, it's my ecosystem, but it is a global ecosystem. Insourced locally would be I am in Kenya and my factory is in Kenya. Outsourced locally would be I am buying from suppliers within Kenyan system, and outsourced globally would be I'm buying from suppliers outside. Now, we can say that if you are insourced locally, this is the highest form of integration and it has the highest level of control and supply chain visibility. You can literally see everything every person within that supply chain is doing. But when you go to outsourced globally, you have the least control but the best costs. This has the worst costs. Insourced locally, the worst cost structure and benefit. But when it comes to outsourced globally, there is a serious cost benefit, but you do not have control over the things that are happening within that. Now, another complexity that you need to remember when we are dealing with whether an integrated system or a disintegrated system is the reverse logistics or return systems to the farm. You need a formula whereby the goods move towards the customer, yes, but also how do they move back into the farm. Now, the complexity then continues. If it is an insourced locally, the return system would be pretty much simple. It is not complex. This is EABL taking their drinks through their trucks to the distributors taking them to the retailers, and the retailers using their bars and clubs and what have you, and the empty trucks coming back to take the empty bottles back into the chain. That's a pretty straightforward system. But for most global firms, it is not as simple as that, because number one, you're dealing with a system or an ecosystem where there is an existing movement of goods forward, and you need an existing movement of goods backwards. Let me give an example of how companies have been caught off guard in this matter. Johnson and Johnson is the first example. They come up with a drug, very good drug, very potent, and it's supposed to cure certain disease. But as it is moving within the supply chain from one step to the other, a certain problem arises, and this problem threatens the very existence of the whole firm. And this is what I mean. At one level within the supply chain, there is an unscrupulous, psychopathic, or murderous person who decides to lace the drugs with potassium cyanide. That means that every customer that will be buying that product is buying a product that was good at source, but for some weird reason they will die. So there were cases of people dying right, left, center, and Johnson and Johnson was forced to investigate what the cause could be. It is not enough to know exactly where the problem started, because we said if you have supply chain visibility, you'll be able to tell where Johnson and Johnson did establish that. But the issue is, now that we know that the drugs were laced with potassium cyanide, how do we get these products back to the farm and correct the issue? Now that calls for a return system that is very, very complex, because number one, you are moving goods within a crisis. You are moving goods within a time when you are likely to have Senate hearings, and there is some bit of culpability and potential settlement suits which will be counted to the millions. But it is not a mistake of your own, but it is not enough to say it is not your mistake. Responsibility must be taken. So they decided, first of all, let's take these products back into the system. That's one. Two, but the good thing that they did, and a lesson to take from them, is that they went beyond the ethical minimum, and they introduced what we have today within the drug industry, which is sealing drugs. If the drug is unsealed, kindly do not use it. That's a standard, and those are lessons that we can find from this whole thing. So when establishing a reverse system, this will be within the modeling unit. It's a very important aspect when discussing disintegrated and integrated systems. So let's go to these production systems. I'm sure a majority of you know them. So let me just erase this. Okay. So we say that you have two types of production systems within your operations. The first one is called a pull system. The second one is called a push system, and it's a spectrum, as it were. On one end you have a push, and on the other end you have a pull. A push system is where I produce goods first, stock them, then push them through marketing and other functions. You produce before demand is even realized. And sometimes we do this because we are working with a functional product. That's a push system. A pull system, on the other hand, is a lean approach system, and it seeks to minimize wastage as much as possible. And at its center is a maxim that holds: do nothing until customer orders. That means production begins once orders arrive. This is a system that seeks to deal with wastage completely, where we say we cannot produce until the customer says produce. And it is a lean approach nonetheless. So if I say that I'm producing because there is a customer order, it's a situation that is as close as possible to D equals S, demand equals supply, a desirable situation. The push system is more concerned about giving availability even before the customer orders, because when the customer enters a premises, they expect the products to be there. A pull system, on the other hand, may not be more concerned about availability, but is more concerned about dealing with demand uncertainty, perhaps again because the price inherent or the cost of production is somewhat high. So if I were to draw a representation of these two, it would be something like this. You have a supply chain here, you have the manufacturing firm, you have the distributor, you have the retailer, then you have the consumer on this end. This here is what you call a typical push system. Manufacturer produces goods before the customer here has ordered, gives them to the distributor before the customer here has ordered, gives them to the retailer before the customer has ordered. Then when the customer needs the goods, they'll go and find them within the premises. You see, a very ideal situation. Availability is enhanced. But there's some situations where you say, I don't want to have the retailer, I don't want to have the distributor. I would like the customer to order direct to the manufacturer. Now, the manufacturer in this case will say, I will not produce until the customer places an order. Perhaps, again, because of what we said, the cost of production of that product is too high. Let's think of an example, the Mabati roofing solutions. You have the conventional push system, which says you produce the Mabati as a Maisha company, push them to the distributor, push them to the retailer. But there are sometimes we will say a customer can order something specific, maybe in color or design. Now, this kind of order we do not produce until we get it within our premises. And it's only when we get it do we start producing, because we know we'll be able to offset the cost of production. So I call it a spectrum because of those two situations I've just introduced. It is highly unlikely that a firm is a purely pull or a purely push. Most times they will be falling within a spectrum over here. And the whole purpose of this whole uh, dance that we are dancing between push and pull is to manage the uncertainty within the demand and supply paradigm, as it were. I do not know how much is too much, and I do not know when the order will come in. So let me produce as I wait, or sometimes let me wait until the customer orders. So within the push pull, within these two production systems, we have several variants. The first variant is what you call a make to stock system. The second variant is what we call a make to order system. The last variant is what we call a configure to order system. A make to stock system is basically what we've been talking about. I make the product, stock them, then I use advertising to create demand for that product. Make to stock. Make the product, stock it, advertise. A make to order is where I do nothing until I receive those orders. Again, because the cost of production could be high, demand could be uncertain, and there are too many variables within the supply chain that would mean we lose money or create wastage within our ecosystem. But the most interesting one of the three would be C2O, and this is where you have a hybrid between a push system and a pull system, and this is called configure to order. Configure to order. And configure to order is a hybrid of a make to stock system and a make to order system, and it allows the customer to configure the order. It's something that has been used in Dell, where the customer simply goes on their website and says, I would like a machine that is 32-inch screen, a 520 GB hard disk, i7 processor, 2 GB RAM, all those things that you are doing there. That is a form of configuration, configure to order. But behind the C2O, there are already the raw materials that use an MTS to create the final product. Now, let's move away from the complexities of it and give a very simple example. The minute you walk into Pizza Inn, we really do not know how many people will order Hawaiian pizza. It's a configured pizza. But what we do know is within Pizza Inn, we need the pineapples, we need the bacon, and we need the dough. So a configure to order is where I stock the raw materials first and I wait for the final order. Another example, I am Adidas. I have a license to print jerseys for the Premier League. We just started the league, but I cannot be able to tell which team is exactly going to win the league. Now I'll make a mistake if I printed all team jerseys equal, because the demand will not be the same. So what will I do? I will print all jerseys for the main leagues, for main teams, sorry. Chelsea, Liverpool, there'll be Man City, there'll be Man U, and Arsenal. I'll print them all equally at the start of the league. But I'll be keeping a very tight research team to track the conversations and be able to tell which is the team that is likely to win. As we are advancing, it is Man City, and nonetheless, therefore, we say we print more of Man City. But I've not put a name on it yet, because I want to wait until I know which is the household name for that team, and it could be, for example, Alan. So that combination right there is what we're speaking about. I am postponing. It is a form of postponing, one, and it is a form of also configuring the order, two. within that disparity then is where you're trying to operate to find a sweet spot where you can meet your demand without creating unnecessary wastage within your whole ecosystem, you see. But beyond determining your production system, beyond determining your variance, you also need to be able to tell what are the parameters that you need to consider when designing a supply chain. And this is what we're going to speak about next. Let me just erase this. Okay. So when designing a supply chain, what are the factors to consider? The first factor that we always say is a non-negotiable is the type of product. The second thing is the demand of the product. Demand of the product. So at this stage, we are trying to ask ourselves, do I need a retailer? Do I need a distributor? Do I need an offshore 3PL? What functions do I need to keep in-house? What functions do I need to give to another person? All those are typical and very important questions you need to try and answer through and through. So the question then becomes, what two factors are these that you need to consider when answering those questions? And the first factor is the type of product that you have in place. The second is the demand of the product. So under the type, we are just trying to ask or answer this question. Is the product a functional product? Is the product a functional product? Or is the product an innovative product? Under demand type, we are trying to answer, is the demand certain? Or is the demand uncertain? These are the two things that we are basically trying to bring on board. What is functional? And what do we mean when we say innovative? A functional product is a product that helps within the day-to-day activities. For example, you need unga to run, you need milk, you need maize. Those are functional products. They are needed, they are necessities, they are basic bare minimums. An innovative product, on the other hand, can be a functional product built differently, or something novel and new. Something novel and new. So we can say a car is functional. It's a means of transport. It's a basic necessity. So a Toyota is a functional car, but a Lamborghini is an innovative car. Follow the difference. We can say a laptop is a functional product. It's a necessity. A phone is a necessity. But within that spectrum of necessities, we have an iPhone 15, which is an innovative product. Then we have the usual Huawei and Techno brands, which are functional in nature. So you can have the same product within the same industry or within the same frame of view, but one is functional, the other is innovative. So within that spectrum, where does your product lie? Is it a functional or an innovative product? A TV is a functional product. It's not a basic minimum, but it doesn't help not to have it. So we have a functional TV, basic 54-inch and what have you, basic TV. Then as you move towards innovativeness, you have a smart TV, you have a curved TV, you have a 3D TV, you have all those features that move that product towards the innovative end of the same spectrum. So after you've determined is the product functional or innovative, you must determine is the demand certain or uncertain. And we say that the demand is certain if you can be able to pinpoint the user cycles within that product. That is certain. But if you cannot be able to tell the user cycles of that product, the demand is not certain. We have Cadbury chocolate. Demand is uncertain in some cases, but during some seasons it is certain. We have milk. Demand is certain. You have flour. Demand is certain. You have all those things that you need in your house to run. Demand is certain. So then when determining, will I design this supply chain this way or that way, you have the following four combinations. You have a functional product whose demand is certain. Then you have a functional product whose demand is uncertain. Then you have an innovative product whose demand is certain. Then you have an innovative product whose demand is uncertain. Now the decision rule is, if you have a functional product whose demand is certain, you are designing an efficient supply chain. This is the supply chain design option that you will need to use. If the product is innovative, demand is uncertain, then you are creating what you call a responsive supply chain. I repeat, there are four possible scenarios that you can have at any point. The first one is a functional product whose demand is certain. The second one is a functional product whose demand is uncertain. The third one is innovative product whose demand is certain. The fourth one is innovative product whose demand is uncertain. The simpler covering rules are this. If you fall here, you create what you call an efficient supply chain design. If you fall here, you create what you call a responsive supply chain design. But this is where most companies get the dilemma, and sometimes you find you play with an efficient supply chain that is a hybrid of efficient and responsive. And the reason is that the product in question may be functional, but the demand is uncertain. So we do not want to risk the issues that we spoke about earlier. Then the last one is an innovative product, but the demand is certain. So why not choose an efficient supply chain system? But when looking at it, you must look at the case study and all the data that you are getting from that case study and make an informed decision. Is it an efficient system or a responsive system? So lastly for the day, we'll be discussing what are some of the changes that supply chains have gone through the years and how have they been in terms of design, in terms of integration, and in terms of production systems. So let me erase this. Okay. Evolution of supply chains. And there are three. This is recall. I think we did it in MSc. Uh, there are three main supply chain evolutions that we need to look at. The first one is between 1910 and 1920. This we call the Ford supply chain. The second one is between 1950 and 1960. We call this the Toyota supply chain. Then the third one is between 1995 to 2000. This we call the Dell supply chain. Let's look at Ford. What exactly did they do? So when Ford encapsulated his vision, he said that I have a vision that one day it will be possible to mass produce vehicles for the general mass. And he was talking of the middle income generation then. This is something that had never been done before. It is something that had never been envisioned. The only mass production was for basic items, but never something as technical and as complex as a car. But Ford thought it could be done, and he did do it. So among the things that Ford was able to do is he used what you call an integrated system. And in integrated system, he owned the iron ore, the refinery, the machining sections, the assembly, and the distribution. This is an integrated system owned by the same company. Now, if you've been following what we've been saying, the only reason why a firm would opt this is because they want more control over cost. They want to be able to control each and everything that is happening within the supply chain. Now, the advantage of it is control, but the cost, not so much. It's a very rigid system of production. Was a very rigid system, so much so that it took 81 hours to convert iron ore into a car. The current standard will be anything between 4 hours, mass production standard, producing a car once you have all the items there. But for Ford, it was taking 81 hours. That's a very long time. The other problem was that they had issues with variety because it's a very rigid system. Ford could only give you one color, black. They could only give you one model, Model T. Now, you have already compromised on the color preferences of the customer and the model preferences of the customer, and you're pushing down a given model down the throat of the consumer base. That is not how the auto industry works. Variety in terms of color is a bare minimum, and in terms of models. But do not forget, Ford's vision was not a global vision, it was an American dream sort of vision. Now, in comes Toyota, and this is 1950. Toyota has an idea that we can be able to reach the masses, and I mean globally. And for us to be able to reach global markets, Africa, Asia, and America alike, we need to be a disintegrated firm. And under disintegrated, it meant Toyota did not own everything. Didn't own everything. They basically outsourced to other suppliers, and they used what you call Kiretsu system. Kiretsu system combined with the JIT system, and this is where you enter into long-term agreements with your suppliers, and you're giving them contracts worth 25 years, which gives them incentives to bring their production systems near you. So if this is Toyota, for example, you have suppliers that are basically 15 to 45 minutes away from you. Now, this is the ideal situation when it comes to production. It means that you do not need warehouses within your premises, since your suppliers have been incentivized to come and establish shop near you 15 and 40 minutes away. So you only integrate your stock system with that of the suppliers, and they'll be able to track it and know when to bring the items within your organization. It was a perfect system. So perfect was it that the flexibility that we know today can only be explained using these old systems of thought, where they can give you any color, can give you any model, they can modify any model. Their production system is very flexible when it comes to making changes. Now, those are achieved by disintegration, but don't forget, it is not control that they were interested in, it was cost. Keep the cost as low as possible, and this is what helped them integrate themselves within the auto industry and find a niche within the low cost vehicle manufacturing, Africa being the biggest consumer and Asia. That is an advantage, but it doesn't come without problems, because there is always a problem of complacency when you have long-term contracts with any partner. You're giving them a contract worth 25 years, so they are assured of business whether they improve their systems or not. They are assured of business whether things are going okay on your end or not. Now, that is not a symbiotic relationship. It is more parasitic in nature, and it will cost you at some point. And this was discovered when Toyota dispatched a vehicle, I think it's Mark X or Mark II, that had sticking gas pedals, and during the investigation they discovered that it was an engineering issue and it was a quality issue being caused by complacent suppliers within their ecosystem. Now, to solve this problem, we enter Dell's system 1995 to 2000. Dell decided never give a long-term contract to supplier. Instead, use what we call performance-based contracting, and these were short-term contracts that would be reviewed in terms of how are you performing. Well, this system and this system were both make-to-stock systems. Dell decided to opt for a make-to-order system where nothing happens until the customer orders. Now, this has been combined with current segmentation. We have moved from customization to segmentation, but this is what was during 1995 to 2000. Then lastly, it uses heavily the use of electronic technologies to improve on their information ecosystem. Now, if you look at the three main stages of changes that we've seen through, we can see that the most competitive firms are leveraging on technology and leveraging on making sure that the supplier is working. There's no conflict of interest, as it were, between the supplier and the buyer. That collaborative type of working with suppliers. And there are many changes, as we shall see in other classes, but for me, I think these three encapsulate the key evolutions that all supply chains have gone through. So that's it for this introductory class. I'll be sending the videos for class 2 in the coming series. So I hope you learned a thing or two. If you have a question, do shoot an email at dchege@jquad.ac.ke. That will be all. A lovely day ahead. Thank you.